Welcome back to the Whitmercast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. I'm your host for today, Jason Smith, and in this episode I talk with W. Paul Reeve and Christopher B. Rich, two of the authors of This Abominable Slavery, Race, Religion, and the Battle Over Human Bondage in Antebellum, Utah, published by Oxford University Press. This important book details the legal and theological debates of mid-19th century Utah over race and labor. If you'd like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes and journals, go to www.jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started. First, let me welcome Paul and Christopher to the podcast. Glad that you could join us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? Who wants to go first?
Absolutely. I guess I'll go first. So my name is Christopher Rich. My first profession is as an attorney. I spent 11 years active duty as a judge advocate in the U.S. Army. And I came off active duty about 4 or 5 years ago. I'm still a reservist. But I had been working with Paul on this wonderful book project for quite a while and decided to make a go of it as a historian. So I have been getting my PhD up at the University of Utah, all but dissertation at this point. And so now I get to do history with law as my side gig.
And I'm Paul Reeve. I'm Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies at the University of Utah. A lot of my scholarship is focused on religion and race, including racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I oversee the Century of Black Mormons project at the University of Utah, attempting to identify everyone of Black African ancestry baptized into the LDS faith between 1830 and 1930.
Wonderful. And Christopher, thank you for your service.
It's my pleasure, always has been. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about the project overall.
Yeah, I can give that a go. So This Abominable Slavery attempts to answer the question, how does Utah Territory grapple with the same questions that are animating the nation in the 1850s and in fact tearing the nation apart? Can human beings be held as property? And Northerners tend to suggest that slavery is a violation of the founding principles of the nation, violation of principles that Thomas Jefferson articulates in the Declaration of Independence, and that human beings can't and shouldn't be held as property. And Southerners will appeal to the Constitution, say that human beings can be held as property, and in fact, the Constitution protects property rights. And so you can't strip a person of their property rights because that's a violation of the Constitution. And in their minds, that includes human beings. And so that's really the question animating the nation in the 1850s. And the nation can't solve that question without the loss of 600,000 lives in a civil war. Our book attempts to address how Utah Territory in 1852 answers that question, both for African American enslaved in the territory as well as Native American enslaved in the territory.
A little bit of historiography, if you don't mind. What's been out there that touches on this before your book?
Yeah, so for Utah Territory, you have Noel Brinkhurst's book, Saints, Slaves, and Blacks, which attempted to address the question about slavery amongst the Latter-day Saints, both before arriving in Utah Territory and then after arriving in Utah Territory. And then you have recent historiography, which has turned its attention towards enslavement in the American West. So there are books about enslavement in other areas of the Mexican Cession, the land that was acquired by the United States as a result of the U.S. war with Mexico. And a lot of the historiography has focused on New Mexico and California. And we are attempting to add the missing puzzle piece in terms of what takes place in Utah Territory. And, I think Newell did a great job of addressing that with the sources that were available at the time. But we have a whole new set of speeches that had never been transcribed from their original Pittman shorthand until Legene Purcell Carruth, our co-author on this project, transcribed them in 2013. And so we have just a flood of new primary source information available upon which our research is based.
I'm glad you brought up the shorthand in Legene. I was about to ask you that. How did this project get started?
Well, so I was doing research for A Religion of a Different Color, my book that I published in 2015, and was trying to just figure out when Brigham Young said what about the racial, priesthood, and temple restrictions within the LDS faith. And I had written a draft chapter for that book, and I had based on the existing historiography, sort of narrowed things down to a speech that Brigham Young gave either on the 5th of January, 1852 or the 5th of February, 1852. And I was trying to figure out what he said and what date did he say it. Submitted a question to the Church History Library. Is there a Pittman version of a speech Brigham Young gave on the 5th of January or 5th of February, 1852? The only response I received back was there is no Pittman version of a 5th of January speech, but they didn't address the 5th of February. And in the meantime, I had asked Chris to review my draft of that chapter because he had published an article on the act in relation to service in the Utah Historical Quarterly. And Chris responded to me and said, I really think it's the 5th of February. So I resubmitted a question to the Church History Library, only asking about a Brigham Young Pittman speech on the 5th of February, 1852. And this time the response came back, not only is there a Pittman version of a Brigham Young speech on that date, but there's an entire file in the George Watt collection of the territorial legislative session that has never been transcribed. And so that's the origin story of this book project. Legene was then assigned by the Church History Library to transcribe that file, and we have the new information upon which this book was based as a result of that. And, Chris and I were sort of on pins and needles over the next several months, just sort of waiting for each new speech to be transcribed by Legene and what new information would emerge. And we then requested, to use those speeches to write a study of this legislative session. I was given permission to use the sources in Religion of a Different Color, but we then believed that it deserved its own treatment. And so this book is the result.
What is the audience that you're aiming for with this book? You think more of an academic audience or a popular audience?
I think we were always hoping that this would speak to both a popular audience and an academic audience. When I had originally started looking at these questions, it was largely from a legal perspective. And so as I started, before we were able to find all these speeches, it was largely a question of statutory interpretation because there just wasn't all that much out there. But as we found these speeches, as Paul mentioned, and as we started talking about how do we put this forward, it was always very important to us that we could answer questions that a general audience might have. And among other things, we wanted to make sure that people were aware that these speeches existed and to be able to provide them to as wide an audience as possible. Originally, when we were publishing the book, we wanted to publish a large number of documents in the book itself. And that just didn't work out for various reasons. But so Paul really spearheaded an effort to put these documents on a website at the University of Utah called thisabominableslavery.org.
Well, I can tell you that I found the book very approachable, and the stories that you tell really bring to life the situation some of these people found themselves in. Let's dig into the book a little bit. The 1852 Utah Territorial Legislative Session. Can you kind of set the stage for this and the lead up to it?
Sure. So Utah had only become a U.S. territory 2 years before this. And it was brought into the Union under a principle called popular sovereignty, which ostensibly permitted citizens in the U.S. territories to determine whether they would legalize slavery or not. And it was an interesting idea, an interesting premise to put forward, because no one actually believed that anybody would hold enslaved people in, say, Utah or New Mexico, which were both brought in under the idea of popular sovereignty. At least in terms of African slavery, the idea was that these areas are just too dry. You cannot sustain plantation agriculture that would be necessary to have large scale slavery as they have in the South. But there were a lot of political and constitutional questions about the rights of Southerners to bring slave property with them if they moved west into places like Utah, New Mexico, California. And so in the 1852 legislative session, the legislators are for the first time trying to make this determination. They knew that under popular sovereignty, they had the ability to legalize slavery if they wished to, but they needed to make a determination whether they felt that was the right way to go. And this was, of course, not just about African slavery, but also Native American slavery. When you had some Latter-day Saints who came from the South, who brought enslaved African Americans with them to what would become Utah Territory. So the question was, what is the legal status of these people? At the same time, you had Native American slavery, which had been ongoing for a very long time. And Latter-day Saints had to understand, what do we do with these individuals as well? Ute enslavers were selling typically children, but sometimes adult women as well, to Latter-day Saints. Latter-day Saints felt that they, in some cases, had to purchase them or they would be killed. And so, what is their legal status? And this was the first opportunity that the legislature really had to address that question. For a long time, the leaders of the LDS Church had really tried to duck the question for a lot of reasons. They didn't want to cause any ripples politically in Washington. The question of slavery was so fraught. At the same time, they did not want to split the church over the question of slavery. Most of the leaders, Brigham Young, for example, were actually anti-slavery in outlook. They did not believe that it was right to hold a person as property. But as I mentioned, they also didn't want to cause these bigger issues. So they had to, so in the 52 legislature, they had to finally make that determination.
I'll just add, Jason, that there's Spanish enslaver that is arrested in Utah Territory and put on trial. He is captured with a Native American woman and children, and he is tried for trading without a license. He's got a trade license from New Mexico Territory, but not from Utah Territory. And he's found guilty and sent back to New Mexico. And that also then just brings the issue to the forefront. And there's even some overlap, chronological overlap, between the beginning of the legislative session and his second trial in the territory. Many of the people involved in his trials are also legislators. So there's a chronological overlap, but also overlap between the individuals involved. And that also seems to be on Brigham Young's mind. He actually refers to it in one of his speeches, the trials of Lujan. And so that also seems to be animating the desire to legislate around African American and Native American enslavement in the territory and to solve those problems. I think their hope was to prevent future traffickers from New Mexico territory coming into Utah territory, right, by legislating around Native American enslavement, but also to then address, like Chris said, African American enslavement in the territory as well.
You mentioned not only the African chattel type slavery, but Native Americans. And can you tell us a little bit about this idea of unfree labor and servitude?
Yeah, so we, as 21st century Americans, tend to think of labor in a bifurcated way, that there's either free labor, which is what we're normally used to. We go to a job, we can quit anytime we want to. Nobody can force us to continue to work. Or on the other hand, slavery, that if somebody can force you to labor if you do not wish to, that we simply call that slavery. Well, that's not how people would have thought about it in the mid 19th century. There's a larger category which was called unfree labor. And within this category of unfree labor, you had a variety of different kinds of what we might call servitude, going from apprenticeship, indentured servitude, debt servitude, all the way to chattel slavery. And all these were slightly different from one another, potentially in terms of service. In some cases, you might be involved in unfree labor and still receive some sort of salary. But what was similar about all of these types of unfree labor is that once you entered into that kind of relationship, either voluntarily through a contract or involuntarily by becoming somebody's property, by law, you had to continue to work for that individual, for your master, until the terms of the contract were filled. And the thing that typically made chattel slavery different from these other forms of unfree labor is number one, it had no end date. It could continue for life. Number two, it was hereditary, meaning it would pass on to one's children. So it would continue forward through the generations. And number three, the person, him or herself, was considered property who could be bought and sold. Whereas with these other forms of unfree labor, generally speaking, they were not hereditary. It didn't pass on to future generations. In some cases, it could last for life, but usually it was for a shorter term. For an apprenticeship, for example, it was maybe 7 years or so. Indentured servitude was usually the same, although it could be longer. And yet again, the individual was not considered property. The labor of that individual could be sold to another person, but that individual was a person who had human rights, who could sue and be sued, generally speaking, could own property. And so in the mid 19th century, people still made a distinction between these different types of labor. The nation was moving towards a free labor ethic. And so there were some people who were beginning to conflate these different types of unfree labor into a category which they called slavery. But there were still many, many people in the United States who would have differentiated between apprenticeship, indentured servitude, and slavery on the far end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and the two that stand out in the book to me are Brigham Young and Orson Pratt, and their different views on this. Um, can you tell me a little bit about the distinction that they made?
So what we highlight in the book is just the way that Brigham Young and other legislators look backward to the unfree labor categories that Chris just articulated that they were familiar with when they came of age in the nation. Brigham Young himself was an apprentice, and other legislators were as well. And so they are looking backward toward those categories and want to use them in Utah Territory to deal with African American and Native American enslavement in the territory. Orson Pratt represents the free labor ethic that's sweeping in across the nation. And so really, those two men, both very strong-willed, are butting heads throughout this legislative session. And Orson Pratt will look at both the act in relation to service, which is passed to govern the relationship between white enslavers and their black enslaved in the territory, and the Native American Indenture Bill, and he will call both of them slavery. And the title of the book actually comes from one of Orson Pratt's speeches, in which he describes African American slavery as this abominable slavery. But he also says the Native American Indenture Bill, which the legislature passes, which limits Native Americans to indentures for up to 20 years, he still says we're enslaving them for 20 years. I don't care if, there is an end date, it's still slavery. And so Orson Pratt then represents this free labor ethic sweeping in across the nation. And we see those two forces, coming into conflict, really, in the person of Brigham Young and Orson Pratt in this legislative session. And they give both very heated speeches opposing each other and opposing each other's points of view in the legislative session.
In this legislative session, a lot of these legislators are church leaders, aren't they? I mean, these are priesthood leaders in the church.
Yeah, so we do in the introductory chapter a collective biography, and these are committed Latter-day Saints. There are apostles and members of the First Presidency who are legislators, as well as stake presidents and local leaders. So it really is a committed group of white men who are the legislators. All of them are Latter-day Saints. A good portion of them, joined the faith early, demonstrated their commitment through the challenges that the faith experienced in Missouri and Illinois. And so you really have committed Latter-day Saints and a swath of the leadership who are represented in this legislative session.
And so what you have because of that is not simply a debate of what constitutes slavery, even though that is a major part of the discussion. Where, as Paul said, Orson Pratt is taking a variety of forms of unfree labor and saying this is slavery, whereas Brigham Young is saying, no, it may be unfree labor, but this is not slavery. Even while you have those ongoing discussions, you get into theological debates about the place of African Americans and Native Americans, but mostly African Americans within the LDS Church. And many of the explanations or justifications for various beliefs in regard to servitude are based on these theological debates, largely dealing with the curse of Cain, the curse of Canaan, the curse of Ham, these biblical curses from Genesis, which for 1,000 years or more, Christians, Muslims, Jews had all used the so-called curse of Cain in order to justify African slavery. Brigham Young and Orson Pratt take fundamentally different views of what this curse is, to whom it applies, if it applies to anyone, and use those justifications as part of their individual arguments concerning servitude in Utah Territory.
Didn't Orson Pratt also he leaned more towards a premortal reason for the race ban than a cursed lineage?
Yeah, no, that's correct. In the legislative session, he will argue against any notion of multi-generational curses. He basically takes the position that God may curse people in Old Testament times. That has nothing to do with 1852 Utah Territory. Those curses that exist in the Bible do not pass down. And he says he defines people of Black African ancestry as innocent, and Brigham Young defines them as inherently guilty, based on these curses that Chris described. And the theological curse for Brigham Young, Cain kills his brother Abel. Because Cain killed Abel, all of Abel's supposed descendants, who he believes to be white people, will need to receive the priesthood before any of Cain's descendants, who he supposes to be Black people, can receive the priesthood. And so that's the way in which politics and religion mix, as Chris articulated. And Orson Pratt will, in opposition to that, define people of Black African ancestry as innocent. And we know later in 1856, he will also say, we have no proof that Africans are descendants of Cain. So he rejects that outright, and that's Brigham Young's only justification for a racial priesthood and temple restriction. But in 1853, so the year after the legislative session, he will posit this notion of a premortal idea in 1853 in the Seer, the newspaper he publishes in New York. And he'll say, well, maybe people of Black African ancestry made evil choices or poor choices in the premortal realm, and that accounts for the priesthood restriction. He uses very cautious language in that 1853 article, more speculative language. Brigham Young uses very forceful language in terms of his assertion of the curse of Cain and the priesthood restriction. Orson Pratt will use speculative language, and he never returns to it for the rest of his life. So I don't know what prompts that 1853 newspaper article, but really the debate between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt then give us the two competing reasons for the racial restrictions that continue to exist amongst Latter-day Saints, into the 20th century, and even though they've been disavowed by the First Presidency, continue to exist amongst Latter-day Saints in the 21st century.
So let's talk about the acts, the acts for the relief of Indian slaves and prisoners, and then the act in relation to service. How did these play out in the daily lives of people?
Yeah, and it's a tough question, because there's not a lot of evidence, unfortunately, and we tried the best that we could to take what little documentary evidence it was available to try and understand how that actually did play out. We know that in some circumstances, people tried to act in conformity with these laws, which is they were required to register their servants with a probate judge. In the case of an act in relation to service, the enslaved individual was supposed to indicate that they had voluntarily come to Utah Territory. If there was ever a sale of that person or a transfer of that person to another individual, by law, they were once again supposed to go before a probate judge, and that affected individual was supposed to give consent. And these laws, again, particularly in act in relation to service, were genuinely based on this idea of consent. The legislators who put them into practice seem to believe that African American servants who came to Utah could and would give consent to these relationships in some way. They didn't exactly define how that was supposed to happen. We don't have a lot of evidence about whether that happened in practice. We know that in some circumstances that the law was used to help African Americans. There was a enslaved man named Dan who was made a servant in Utah Territory, and his enslavers wanted to take him back to Texas. He ran away and actually complained to a Latter-day Saint bishop after Dan's reputed owners tried to recapture him, and they were arrested for kidnapping. It never got to a full trial, but there was a preliminary hearing in which Daniel was permitted to testify, which was something that not only would have never happened in the South. There were many free states where an African American would not have been permitted to testify in open court. And the judge, Elias Smith, ultimately determined that there was not enough evidence to bind these individuals over for trial. But he writes in his journal that he believed that they were guilty of the charges because they had been trying to remove Daniel out of the territory without his consent. And ultimately, Daniel stays within the territory. So that's one instance where we do have a good idea of what happened. And but there's many other times when it's open to conjecture. Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add maybe this notion, Chris is describing the idea of consent that is bound up in the act in relation to service. Consent if you are to be sold from one enslaver to another, consent before you can be removed from the territory, consent to be brought to the territory. Difficult to figure it out how that might have played out in practice. But that's the reason why Brigham Young doesn't believe what Utah passes is chattel slavery. If you have consent, you're not mere property. And so in his estimation, this elevates those who are enslaved in Utah Territory above the condition of mere property because consent recognizes that they are human beings who can offer consent. And so in his estimation, Utah has not passed a bill that equates to chattel slavery, even though Southern enslavers are saying we can still keep these enslaved people for life, right? So it doesn't free anyone then enslaved, but it does grant them some rights that they would not have held had they been maintained as property in the South. And it does also stipulate that those who are brought to Utah Territory have to be educated. And chattel slavery laws in the South prevented Black people from being educated. So there are some distinctions, right? And it's important to understand sort of these nuances to know why Brigham Young believes what they pass in Utah Territory doesn't equate to to chattel slavery. But your question also gets at, well, what does this mean in the lives of those who are enslaved? And we, in the later chapters in the book, try to address that as well. So we try to understand what it means from the perspective of the legislators who pass these laws, but also then what it means in the lives of those who are enslaved. And we make the point that probably none of the enslaved, if they are aware of the passage of this law at all, wake up the next day and say, oh, my life is somehow so much better now that we've been legally defined as a servant instead of a slave and granted some rights. But as Chris points out, at least in the case of Daniel Camp, it does provide him some protection when the law was enforced in his favor. He is not allowed to be taken from the territory against his will. And then, we could speak about the Native American Indenture Bill. It puts a 20-year time limit on how long a Native American could be indentured to, white people in Utah Territory. They are also supposed to take the Native American indentures to a probate judge and register them before probate. And we found two such cases, one from Sevier County and one from Iron County. And we analyze them in the book. The bill uses the language of apprenticeship, and so they're supposed to be indentured. They're supposed to then learn some craft, some occupational skill, so that when the indenture is over, in theory, they can then enter white society with marketable skills, and the ideal is that they would then integrate. There are other scholars who have studied those who are indentured in Latter-day Saint homes and conclude there are roughly 400 by the turn of the 20th century, and that the ideals of the law don't play out as ideally in practice in all of the cases. And we try to offer the readers a spectrum of examples so that we can look at what we found in practice playing out, goes all the way from these fictive kinship relationships where Latter-day Saints do seem to take these Native American indentured children and take them into their families and use the language of kinship in their relationships. All the way to a probate record in which two Native American children are listed in the probate amongst the property of the probate holder, not amongst the children, right? And given a dollar value. So the two Native American children given a dollar value, $95, and listed with the plows and all the other property in the probate. And so, there's a whole spectrum then of the ways in which we could ferret out that the indenture bill plays out in the lives of actual Native Americans in Utah Territory.
What other rights did these indentured servants have besides the right to consent and not be transferred against their will?
And so there's a section in the Act in Relation to Service that criminalizes white people having sex with Black people, not just marriage, but actually having sex. And this is really designed to prevent white enslavers from raping Black enslaved, which is a part of chattel slavery in the American South. And so it criminalizes that in the bill. And the other case that we make is that, in fact, the first two provisions of the Act in Relation to Service are actually aimed at white, those who immigrate to Utah Territory in debt, right? These are white immigrants who come to Utah Territory, and they have to pay off their debt, and they can use their labor to do so. And the first two provisions of the bill address that. I'm trying to think if
another major issue is that this status was no longer heritable.
there, yeah.
Whereas under chattel slavery, as we mentioned before, this would continue through the generations indefinitely. One of the major findings that we have and that we really try and put forward is that the wording of these bills was such that while you could keep somebody in servitude, in some cases for life, that would not pass on to their children. And as a result, we define these as a kind of gradual emancipation. So in many northern states during the late 18th century, early 19th century, they did not immediately abolish slavery. Nobody snapped their fingers and said, hey, everybody is now free. What they would do is adults, they would keep in a state of slavery, but their children would be freed after a certain period of servitude. And then ultimately, after 30, sometimes 40 years, ultimately they would free all of the people who were still enslaved, many of whom would be very aged by that time. And we believe that that's essentially what Brigham Young and the legislators were trying to do with an act in relation to service is, number one, put them in a status that was not chattel slavery and ensure that that status would not pass on to their children over time, so that gradually this form of servitude would eventually die out. However, it could last for life in the first instance. So even though it was designed to end over time, for some of these people who were relatively young when they came to Utah Territory, had the law remained in force for the next 60, 70 years, those people might have remained in service that entire time.
And I'll just add, Jason, for the Native American Indenture Bill, it also requires education for Native American indentures, 20-year expiration, and it also stipulates that they need to be provided adequate food, shelter, and clothing. And the two indentures that we found included freedom dues, so that when the indentures expired, they were given a change of clothing, and in one case, a Book of Mormon, which illustrates, right, the sense of trying to instill religious ideals, the religious overlay for that particular indentured Native American. So the Native American Indenture Bill also provided some of those stipulations and included the freedom dues in both of the cases that we found in the probate registers.
And many of the legislators compared these forms of service to apprenticeship or indentured servitude for white people. They, at least in the records that we have, believed that they were essentially the same sort of thing. And many of them voted for these forms of servitude based on the understanding that they were essentially equivalent to one another. And at the same time that they passed these forms of servitude for African Americans, for Native Americans, there were other forms of servitude which were created for white children, for example. Or as Paul pointed out, a major part of an act in relation to service creates forms of servitude for European immigrants who could not afford to come to Utah Territory any other way other than to borrow through the Perpetual Emigrating Fund or through private lenders. And this permitted indentured servitude in these cases as well. And as Paul mentioned, it's looking backwards to institutions that had existed in the United States for hundreds of years. By the early to mid 19th century, these are dying out and things are moving towards a free labor ethic. But in the economic circumstance of Utah Territory, they are viewing these older forms of servitude as a both morally and practically useful way of moving forward.
And you mentioned if this had stayed in effect, let's talk about when it ended. Your last chapter in your book is Utah's Juneteenth. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we don't know. So there's a legal end, right? But then a much more ambiguous end in practice. So in 1862, Brigham Young gets a letter from Bernheisel, who is Utah's territorial delegate to Congress. And Bernheisel tells Brigham Young that, Congress has basically passed two bills. The Republicans are now in control of Congress in Washington, D.C. The Democrats in the South have seceded, right? And so the Republicans have control of Congress, and they actually make good on their 1856 pledge. Remember, the founding platform of the Republican Party is that Congress has the right and imperative duty to prohibit in the territories the twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. And in 1862, Congress actually does that. They pass the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act, and within a couple of weeks, this act that outlaws slavery and involuntary servitude in the territories. Remember, Abraham Lincoln wins his election by promising that he will protect slavery where it then exists. But remember, Southerners also secede from the Union based upon the fact that he's won the election. The line in the sand is the American West, right? The Republican Party says it cannot expand. And the South says if it doesn't expand, you're going to first outlaw it there and then come after slaves where it then exists. And so this act that passes in 1862 is only aimed at the territories. It's not the Emancipation Proclamation. It's not the 13th Amendment. It is aimed at slavery in the American West, in the territories. And so June 20th, I think, is when Abraham Lincoln, 1862, signs this into law. So that would have been the legal end to enslavement in Utah Territory, but we don't know if anyone knows about it or when enslavers, let alone their enslaved, find out about it. We do find in July a column published in the Deseret News on page 4. Buried in the middle of a column from Washington is the title of the column that says, the president has signed this act prohibiting slavery in the territories into law. There was no fanfare, no sort of big announcement on page 1, no sort of evidence that they tried to get this word out to the enslavers in Utah Territory or those who were enslaved. So when does it end in practice? We simply do not know. And then Chris can tell us, he looked at the laws in Utah Territory that get republished, and the act in relation to service disappears before the act for the further relief of Indian slaves and prisoners disappears from Utah legal code.
Right. So one of the complicated things is, as Paul was mentioning, is when Congress passes this act in 1862, it's not immediately clear how it affects an act in relation to service, for example. Because remember that in 1852, 10 years before, the major arguments in the legislature were, does this constitute slavery? Does this constitute involuntary servitude? And the answer that most of the legislators gave, not Orson Pratt, but the answer that most of the legislators gave is, this is not slavery. And probably most of them would have said, this is not involuntary servitude. They would have pointed to the consent requirements and said, look, these individuals who enter servitude are required to consent. How could that be involuntary? So it's possible that when that 1862 statute was passed, they did not believe that it applied. We just don't know for sure. As Paul mentioned, we know that in a compilation of Utah statutes published in 1866, that an act in relation to service is no longer there. So we don't know precisely why. We don't know if the legislature believed that it had been invalidated by the 1862 law or perhaps by the 13th Amendment. It's not altogether clear. But by 1866, the legislature has decided, no, we can no longer have African American servitude in Utah Territory. However, the Native American Indenture Bill remains on the books for at least another 10 years. Again, probably based on the idea that this is a form of apprenticeship. Maybe they're basing that on the legal fiction that it's voluntary, although that's very difficult to come to that conclusion based on the age of the children who are actually involved. But the same question is happening in New Mexico, for example, where even after the 1862 statute, they continue to have something called peonage or debt servitude, which largely applies to Native Americans and which sometimes does continue down through the generations. But by at least the mid 1870s, neither one of these statutes appears in Utah law anymore. We have not found any evidence of whether they were actually repealed in the legislature or not. There's perhaps some more research to be done there that would be interesting to see. But we know that through the early 20th century, um, Latter-day Saints are still taking Native American children into their homes. Um, and there's no longer a law strictly defining it. These are ad hoc relationships. And as Paul mentioned, probably run a spectrum of relationships. Some of them may have genuinely be viewed as a kind of adoption, that these are now our children, our kin, whereas others were probably more working relationships.
I want to zoom out a little bit from the details of the book and ask you what, when you're working on this, what were some of the more surprising revelations, the aha moments that you had in your research?
I suppose for me, it was interesting coming at this from the beginning because much of the historiography had claimed that slavery per se, that chattel slavery was legal in Utah territory. And coming at it from an attorney's perspective, one of the strangest things was early on was just going and reading these laws, which are sometimes unclear and a little convoluted. And my original response is just reading the language here, these don't seem to accomplish what most people are claiming that they do. But at the same time, realizing that it is very confusing language. Even with the legislative debates, it's still a little bit unclear. And so for me, there was that aha of this does not seem to be doing what most people think it's doing. But then just trying to, I mean, originally all I had was the statutory language. There just wasn't that many other sources. So I was trying to read it like a lawyer reads any other law and just try and figure out, okay, what was the legislature trying to do here? Um, and then it was, I'll say, fun to see, once we had the legislative minutes, to see the debates between the legislators and to say, yeah, that is basically what they were trying to do. I do think I'm interpreting this correctly. So I suppose that's on the positive side of the ahas from my perspective. Paul, did you have?
Yeah, for me, one of the ahas was just the debate between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt and the way that it, like we articulated, spilled over into the theological questions of the racial priesthood and temple restrictions. And so for me, it's an aha that, hey, the origins of those racial restrictions are grounded in very earthly debates, and you have disagreement between two very strong-willed men who have overlapping roles: territorial governor and president of the LDS faith, territorial legislator, and the Latter-day Saint apostle, right? And so they're mixing those roles. And the other aha for me was, Orson Pratt's, I think, willingness to kind of stand alone for some of the principles that he believed in. So I was unaware before, engaging in this project that Orson Pratt was actually advocating for Black male voting rights in 1852. So we also address this election bill, and the fact that Orson Pratt is, well ahead of the rest of much of the nation in terms of advocating for Black men to be able to vote in 1852. Um, and the principled stand that he took, really kind of enamored me to Orson Pratt, Brigham Young gives his really strident speech on the 5th of February, 1852 in the morning, and then Orson Pratt that afternoon votes against the Cedar City and Fillmore incorporation bills. And these are rubber stamp bills. They're just incorporating two cities in the territory. But the legislative minutes tell us that Orson Pratt votes against both of those because they prevented Black men from voting in those municipalities. And we believe that it was his way of just once again pushing back against Brigham Young, standing up for these principles. And so for me, I was encouraged actually to read Pratt's strident anti-slavery speech, the principled stance that he took throughout the legislative session, as well as the fact that he's advocating for Black male voting rights.
What's the takeaway you want people to have after reading this book?
For me, I think the takeaway is, Utah is grappling with the same questions that are tearing at the fabric of union, pulling the nation apart. And despite, the threads of disunion that are tearing at Utah territory, they seem to craft an untidy center that holds. And I'm not calling it, anything brilliant at all. I'm just simply saying you have factions in California, ostensibly a free state, right? But you have Southerners in California who are trying to rip the southern portion of California apart to legalize slavery. You have those who are in favor of enslavement who form Arizona territory, right? You have Kansas, Nebraska, where these forces are pulling Kansas apart. And you have those same forces animating these debates in Utah territory, but never to the point of full fracture. The Southerners in Utah territory seem to wield influence well beyond their numbers in terms of trying to protect what they perceive as their property rights. But you also have forces at play in Utah territory that are stridently against enslavement. And you see that playing out in the territory as well. So, I hope readers come away with a more complex understanding of, the spectrum of unfree labor categories and how Utah grapples with it with the legislative pieces that they come up with.
No, I absolutely agree with that. I hope readers come away with the idea that history is messy, and to really understand how things happened and why, it takes a lot of effort. Very often, we view things from our own perspective. But to actually get into the heads of these legislators and try and get into the heads of people who were enslaved takes a lot of work, because they thought differently than we do. Their presumptions were different from ours, which doesn't mean that we have to automatically give people a free pass or to agree with everything that they've done. But if that we really wish to understand, we have to try and put ourselves in their place, which means trying to understand their assumptions, which means trying to understand the entire world that was around them.
I know that Legene had a large part to play in this book, with the transcribing the Pittman shorthand. Are there any other collaborators or special people that you want to give a shout out to that helped with this project?
Well, I think Legene is profoundly important. The book doesn't exist without Legene's phenomenal ability to read 19th century Pittman. And so, she has just been a fantastic collaborator the entire way through. The other people that I might mention are mentioned in the acknowledgments, but Stephen Snow was Latter-day Saint church historian when all of these new speeches came to light. And, he granted us permission to do this project. And so it also wouldn't exist without him. People like Matthew Grow at the LDS Church History Department were really wonderful to work with. Rick Turley was also an advocate for the project very early on. So without their support, the project also wouldn't exist. And the Church History Department under Matt Grow's direction allowed us to host at the University of Utah uh, Marriott Library all of the documents that we've been talking about, all of the speeches, all of the public documents that we came up with, and wanted to make them publicly available so that anyone can go and read the speeches. We're offering the book as our interpretation of what happened, but anyone can go and read the primary sources. And we just felt like that's an important aspect of this project to make the sources publicly available for anyone to access. So you can read for yourself Brigham Young's 5th of February, 1852 speech. You can look at the Bill of Sale of Lucinda from Abraham Smoot to Thomas Williams. Those primary source documents are all now publicly available. And so I guess that's just my shout out to all of those people who cooperated with us to allow all of this to happen.
Yeah, and we'll include a link to that repository in the description. It is interesting. So, what are you working on now?
I'm working on my dissertation right now, which is a study of the Walker War from 1853 to 1854. I'm going to try and look at it a little bit more broadly, and like this current project, and I think Paul agrees with me on this. One of the problems with Latter-day Saint history is people tend to look at it as something that's entirely unique and that is somehow separated from the mainstream of US history during the 19th century. And one of the things we really try to do in this abominable slavery is show how events in Utah were connected with events that were going on elsewhere in the country. And that's one of the things I hope to be able to do with this study of the Walker War, which some of your viewers may be aware of, is that this is not just a story about a war between Latter-day Saints and Native Americans in this small little area of Utah, that it has implications and connections with things which are going on more broadly in the country.
And I'm continuing to work on the Century Black Mormons project. I've just completed my term as department chair, and so I'll be on sabbatical for the coming year, and I'll be working on some journal articles grounded in what we're learning from that project. And I hope to then move into a cultural history of the Word of Wisdom, the Latter-day Saint Health Code. But for the time being, I will be writing journal articles grounded in the Century of Black Mormons project.
All right, the penultimate question. What should I have asked about that I didn't?
I think you covered it pretty well, Jason. I can't really think of anything. I think we hit the major points. I really can't think of anything. We do, make the point about the priesthood and temple restrictions, but I think we covered that, right? We do say, right, that Latter-day Saints, at least in 5 publications following the 52 legislative session, start to talk about it openly for the first time. And so something happens in that legislative session to make it, at least in the minds of some Latter-day Saints, public knowledge, but also something that they start to defend in newspaper articles. And that happens in the 1850s. The first one in 1852 in the Deseret News, and then other publications start to openly articulate a racial priesthood restriction and defend it.
So one of the things that I find interesting is that we tend to show Brigham Young and Orson Pratt as being on opposite ends of the spectrum. And when it comes to the 1852 legislative session, that's true. But 4 years later, there's a constitutional convention for Utah in which some of these same issues are brought up again. And you have a small group of Southerners who, in the 56 Constitutional Convention, are actually trying to protect chattel slavery in a new constitution for Utah. They've moved beyond this argument about does servitude constitute slavery or not to say, no, we want to positively protect chattel slavery. And in that argument, Orson Pratt and Brigham Young are on the same side. And they say, absolutely not. And in fact, Apostle George A. Smith, for reasons that are not entirely clear, comes in on the side of that small group of Southerners who want to protect chattel slavery. And Brigham Young really takes him to task in much the same way that he had been taking Orson Pratt to task in the 1852 legislature. He's now doing that same thing with people who support the idea of chattel slavery in Utah. And so while Brigham Young and Orson Pratt certainly differ in many of their opinions, they still both are united against this small group of individuals who actually want to legalize true chattel slavery in Utah.
Okay. Last question. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
My email address at the University of Utah, paul.reeve@utah.edu, is probably the best way.
Same thing. I'll give you my University of Utah email address is christopher.b.rich@utah.edu.
Okay. Well, Paul, Christopher, thank you so much for the conversation. It's a great book, and it's an interesting story that needed to be told.
Thank you very much, Jason. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, for the opportunity.
We want to thank you for tuning in to the Whitmercast. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution. For more information, visit www.jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of John Whitmer Historical Association, all rights reserved.